Oh, yeah, nice. It fits. More on that to come, maybe when it's necessary to put it on the car. But for now, it is time. Oh yeah! What's up, team? Let's talk about EFI Fundamentals as they pertain to the Z32 VG30DE. First of all, let me apologize for the long hiatus. I had to bring Andy's Z34 in here and jam out a whole bunch of work on it. Oh, do you want to go inside? Okay. Well, I had to bring his car in here and jam out a whole bunch of work to make it a reliable seat time car with AC, which is pretty much exactly what I'm trying to do to my car, and now I've fallen behind. But that's neither here nor there. I wanted to help a friend make a little cash on the side. It helps fund the race car, so here we are. Anyways, let's get on with it. By the end of this video, I'm hoping that I've opened this box of magic right here and you understand what's going on between it and your engine, so you got a nice healthy running Z32. Now there are three things needed for engine operation, and I know you've heard it a million times, but it's true for carburetors and it's true for EFI. You need air, fuel, and spark in order for an engine to run. The fourth thing is also engine speed. That is really the fourth critical thing that you need to remember about EFI. But other than that, all you need to know is that there are a lot of calculations going on inside of that ECU in order to determine how much air is entering the engine in order to calculate for how much fuel to deliver to the engine and when to give the spark for your power stroke. And all of that is determined on a number of environmental sensors and user input sensors, which gives the ECU what's called an airflow model, and gives us the beauty of EFI, the smooth running, amazing throttle response and gas mileage. Now, there's a ton of calculations that are going on in the ECU in order to, deliver this awesome magical event called EFI. But if you want to learn, real in-depth stuff about this and kind of where I got my start into learning these kinds of things, go and find the books by Greg Banish. He wrote two amazing books on EFI. One will help you learn a little bit more about the nature of tuning, and the other will help you learn more about the nature of ECUs and the sensors themselves. I'm gonna try and cover more of the nature of the ECU and the sensors themselves, and give a little bit of diagnostic advice along the way. So let's go ahead and get right on into it. So without getting too crazy into the math, let's just understand that those calculations exist as controls in the ECU, meaning that they never change, right? Things that never change would be like the laws of physics, right? So there's a relationship between pressure and temperature that allows us to understand the molecular weight of air. How many oxygen molecules are in air as percentage or what have you. Again, these calculations, as they're written, don't necessarily matter for now. Just understand that these are controls and they don't ever change. And so we can plot our fueling and our airflow estimations based on these mathematical congruencies that are always mathematically the same. So as long as we know that air and air molecules are pretty much always the same size or weight at certain temperatures and pressures, then the only other thing that we really need to know is like the molecular size and weight of the fuel, right? So that is actually represented more in the injector data in the ECU. This doesn't exist as the inputs and outputs that I want to talk about in a second, but I do want to talk about fuel first. Now, in the ECU, there is a pre-programmed idea for how much fuel pressure is behind the injector for whatever given vacuum or boost. is in the manifold on the other side of the injector. So when there's a pressure differential there, there's going to be a little bit of fighting in between, a little bit of give and take, right? Depending on those conditions. So Nissan, in their infinite wisdom, decided to use a vacuum referenced rising rate fuel pressure regulator that makes the fuel pressure go up as the intake manifold vacuum goes from vacuum to atmospheric, and then from atmospheric up to boost, depending on if you're naturally aspirated or boosted. Now what that does is that makes it easier for the computer to calculate how much fuel to deliver, because it doesn't have to worry about that pressure differential. It's always in sync with the manifold condition, as long as you set your fuel pressure correctly. That's one of those important things that you need to remember in your diagnostic process there. So fuel pressure, very important. It needs to be adequate, and you need to have fuel volume as well. A weak pump may be delivering good fuel pressure, but it might not have enough volume, and under wide open throttle conditions, it'll start bogging down, and you'll nosedive into the pavement. Now, another thing that the computer is pre-programmed as a control with is the injector flow data. Now, it's not just the injector size, but also how long it takes for that injector to open and how long it takes for it to close. So it's really, really important that you have the correct fuel injectors in your engine and you don't have knockoffs. That's ultimately what causes a bunch of problems, is that they don't open and close at the correct times that are pre-programmed in these ECUs. So make sure you have adequate fuel for your application, and make sure you have adequate fuel injectors. I'll probably reference a little bit more about these controls later as we talk more about the engine and the sensors involved. Next, what I want to outline is that the engine is using what you need to be concerned with, known as inputs and outputs, okay? The outputs are the fuel injectors, the coils, it's also the idle control circuits. There's a number of them on the engine. When you get into an application like what we're gonna be involved with, you'll see that I only use 2 of those idle circuits. And with the VH45, I only use 1 because it's a single throttle body, it's easier, but I'll get into that in another video. Other outputs include boost control, emissions, or even the electronic variable orifice in the steering rack. Now the ECU is switching these things on and off and modulating them as it's gathering all of its sensory data inputs. For now, we're really primarily worried about the fuel injectors and the spark. Now I've already covered the fuel injectors earlier on in the video, so let's talk about spark. And more specifically, let's talk about these 2 guys, the power transistor unit and the ignition coil. First off, I want you to understand that neither of these need to be grounded through their cases here. But in a later video, when we do some more intensive electrical installations on the 2+2, I'll show you where and why we're going to be adding some grounds. So stick around for that. But anyways, this guy right here, the power transistor unit, what this does is it takes a signal from the ECU and it bumps up the charge just a little bit in order to make this guy fire off, all right? So that's the relationship between these 2 right here. So if a driver goes bad in here, you could have a misfire. That's a potential problem, but that's not a likelihood as long as you have good solid connections. The only time I ever see either of these fail is from bad connections, usually bad grounds. What do you mean bad grounds? I mean these guys right here. All the grounds that are located on the engine, these are the EFI harness grounds that the ECU is relying on. So they have to travel all the way back behind the dash, up on in there, and relay the ground for everything going on. So yeah, there's a way that you can improve the grounds, but I promise adding grounds here where the factory never had them, it's not going to help you out. It's not doing really much of anything. I mean, it's pretty much written right there. A little bit of power goes in, a little bit of power goes out. And G for a ground. That's where the ground is, not there. If you do need diagnostic resources, again, you can go to the CZP website, go to the Z32 wiki and look up those fuel injectors, look up that PTU. look up those coils and understand how they work. The description of operation, it really helps you form an idea for what's going on, with those components. And the same thing goes for the inputs that I'm about to cover. If you need a little bit more in-depth technical knowledge and specs on how to diagnose these components, then head right over to that Z32 wiki page. They have all of the specifications there. Everything that you can ohm out, everything you can test for voltage, a switch on or off, it's all there. Now let's talk about the inputs. The inputs for the ECU are going to be filling in a bunch of blanks in those constants that I talked about earlier in order to understand the dynamics of the airflow that's entering the engine. Now they can come up with all the theoretical ideas of what the engine might need, but ultimately the sensors are going to tell the ECU precisely what it needs. In the tuning process, basically what happens is there's an airflow model that's based around the engine setup, and there is a theoretical idea of how much fuel to give it based on any running condition. And the sensors, they do their job to kind of give the ECU an estimate of, well, it needs a little bit more, or well, it needs a little bit less. That all depends on your altitude, how hot or cold of a day it is, how much throttle you're giving it, how much weight is in the car. All of that really comes into play when all of these sensors are doing their thing and the ECU is calculating all of the math that it needs to calculate. And I promise you, there's a ton of it. There's even background math that the guys who are calibrating at the OEM level don't even have access to. All they have access to is certain calibration maps for certain sensors in order to bring fueling into where it needs to be. But for now, we're gonna just focus on a stock ECU. These cars can actually put up with a little bit of modification and still run relatively safe. However, just understand that just the way that these are set up, the way that these are calibrated from factory, whenever you make any modification that exists from here to the O2 sensor and anywhere in between, it needs to be tuned. It absolutely needs to be tuned for just to get a good, long-lasting life out of it, to ensure that you have a nice, smooth, reliable idle and cruising conditions, and you have nice, reliable AFRs under wide open throttle. Yeah, you can get away with modding a stock, engine and stock ECU a little bit for a while, but I really don't recommend it. It's highly recommended to get a tune if you make any changes from this point to that point, anything anywhere in between. Now, I'm going to explain to you why that's really important, beginning with the crank angle sensor. Now, before when I told you that there's a bunch of mathematical constants, with that there's volumetric efficiency. As that cylinder is being pulled down, there's a certain amount of air that's entering that cylinder, right? And it's actually regulated by the throttle blade, right? So when it's closed, it can only pull in so much air, we'll say 10. And that means that the engine is running at 10% volumetric efficiency. It needs a whole lot more data in order to come up with that number. However, in a error event, if you were to unplug all of the sensors, except for the crank angle sensor, it'll still run at idle at a theoretical idle value. It's close enough to real world that the engine will run, a little rich because it's an open loop. It won't have the ability to go closed loop. We'll talk more about open and closed loop later. First, I just need you to understand that in those calculations in the ECU, there exists a calculation that you can figure out how much fuel to give an engine just based on the RPM and the temperature of the air, so long as it knows that it's a 3-liter V6, and how fast it's going. In this sensor, there are two halves, right, of a disc, right? And it's got a whole bunch of windows in it. There's a laser looking through, and there's different size windows. So it knows when it rotates half a turn, the crankshaft has spun once. I'm waiting for another turn to see the second half of the crank angle sensor. Once it sees both halves of the crank angle sensor, It knows the top dead center position of every every cylinder, and it can deliver fuel and it can deliver spark based on theoretical values. And it'll place it in like a cold position where it's like, freezing temperatures or whatever, just so it gives it enough fuel. On a cold start, it'll be fine. Hot start, not so much. I wouldn't try it. I don't suggest it. I have never ever seen these fail. I've only seen the connectors get loose and the wiring break off at the end of the connector kind of deal, but I've never seen the sensor itself ever fail. Make sure that you're clocking this thing just right, because this is the ECU's reference for where top dead center is, right? And that's not just for the ignition, that's also for the fuel injection. So you don't want to screw up the timing of your fuel injectors because it won't run right. This isn't like a regular distributor from back in the day, so don't attempt to advance that thing thinking you're going to get any power out of it, because you're not. So just make sure that this is set to where you're reading 15 degrees before top dead center down on your crankshaft. These timing marks down here on the crankshaft pulley. You'll be good to go. Now that's on a factory setup. Really, like I said, first and foremost, this is the most important sensor on the entire engine. It needs to know engine position, it needs to know engine speed, and that's what it needs to run. From there, we're just gathering more data to get a more precise measurement. So let's move on to the mass airflow sensor. Now, within the mass airflow sensor, there is a hot filament for the air that's moving through the bore of the sensor. And there's also another filament that is there. Well, I'm not sure if it's filament, I could be wrong. But there's another wire in there for the intake air temperature. That's mostly used for coefficients. These are called modifiers, right? So in those calculations, it's going to add a little bit or take away a little bit depending on the environmental conditions, the temperature, right? So on a cold start, it knows that it's cold through the intake air temperature and the coolant temperature sensor. I might as well talk about the coolant temperature sensor because it does the same thing. As the coolant gets hot, as intake air gets hot, it makes adjustments to fueling. So it's really important that those both work really, really well, because there's a significant difference in fueling for cold temperatures and hot temperatures. And both of those guys need to be working absolutely well, and they need to be reading correctly. Now, again, in-depth diagnosis for the mass airflow sensor and the coolant temperature sensor, please look it up for now. We'll get to that later on down the road when we're assembling our engine and comparing sensors side by side. But the hot filament on the mass airflow sensor that is used for measuring the airflow over it, think of that as like a toaster filament, right? It's burning hot and orange. If you blow on it, it cools off and it goes dark, but then the glow comes back again. Imagine that's going on in there, right? And the ECU is monitoring the voltage across that filament, and it's sending a signal back to the ECU and letting the ECU know, okay, there's pretty much this much wind going by it. Now, as air velocity increases and the engine starts getting closer towards peak power, there's more and more wind going by it, and it needs more and more energy. So when you observe this through a data stream, it exists as kind of like a skateboard quarter pipe, right? So that right there is a modeling for the airflow that's moving through the intake duct, right? And that starts the beginning of the closed loop. Again, we'll talk more about closed loop and open loop later, but for now I want you to understand that whatever enters here has to stay in here until it exits way out here, because the ECU is quantifying how much air is moving over that filament and creating a best guess estimate for that weight of air that's moving over it. There's a limitation, however, when it's calculating for the amount of fuel that's moving over it. Say you're just cruising, but then you want to race somebody and you go right to wide open throttle very quickly, right? Well, there's a whole lot of vacuum in the intake manifold when you're like at cruising or at a stoplight. And then when you crack that throttle wide open, there's an immediate rush of air right here in the intake runner that's shooting down into the cylinder and filling it up. And it takes a while for the air that's moving over the mass airflow sensor to catch up through all of this intake ductwork, right? And that needs a little bit of extra fueling. The movement in your throttle here is what the throttle position sensor is for. It receives a signal that has a swept range similar to the mass airflow sensor. When you move it, the computer is able to calculate based on the rate at which you moved it and its position from idle all the way up to wide open throttle. And it uses what's known as throttle enrichment fueling based on those calculations. Throttle enrichment fueling is it keeps the intake wet. So again, when you crack that throttle open and there's an immediate rush of air, it's going to want to pull all the fuel that's wet on the inside of the intake runner. It's going to want to pull it right into the cylinder. So the injector has to spray immediately, and it has to do it before the mass airflow sensor calculation is able to catch up. And that's what the throttle position sensor is for. So make sure that's set correctly. Make sure it's set with the idle switch as well, because idle, I'm going to tell you right now, because we're at that point, idle is where all of your problems are going to show their ugly faces. I promise you. And don't try taking the car out and running it wide open like a freaking dog. And don't sit there, working the throttle, trying to clear it out and everything. It's not going to happen, dude. All right. All your problems at idle are letting you know what's going on inside this engine. And the reason being, when that intake is under a whole bunch of vacuum and there's a really, really slow piston speed, there's not a lot of fuel mixing, right? It's very difficult to keep an engine running at low speeds. So all the problems are going to be very exaggerated, and that's going to be your indicator for how well that engine is going to be running all through the rev range. So get your idle right, and you're going to get the rest of your power right. So let's talk about the O2 sensors. O2 sensors are going to be the first indicator to what is going on with how your engine is running, given if they're operating correctly. New sensors, they should be working as long as you get proper NTK sensors, I would say. But if you can look at the data stream for O2 sensors, you absolutely must, and you must trust the data. If it's, showing lean, it's lean. If it's showing rich, it's rich. They don't lie. Now, let's talk about what O2 sensors do and the difference between an O2 sensor, a narrowband, and a wideband AFR gauge. A wideband AFR gauge is going to show you the actual air to fuel ratio, which is going to be different at cruising to wide open throttle. Cruising is going to be leaner than wide open throttle. Now, lambda, which is really what a narrowband is trying to keep track of, is going to be the stoic value of whatever fuel you're using, whether it's E85, gasoline, diesel, doesn't matter. Lambda is always going to be 1, right? So if it always knows the stoic value of the fuel that you're using, the ECU can monitor the gas that's passing through the sensor. And what it does, because it can't run perfect, you might drive through, like a shady area where it gets a little bit cooler, and then you drive out into the sun and it gets a little bit hotter. You go up a hill, you go, around a turn. All those little minor changes in engine running condition are going to show up in the O2 sensor. And what it does is it's trying to chase that perfection, just because it'll never hold perfectly stable in that 1 or 0. What it does is it'll go a little bit lean, add a little bit of fuel, go a little rich, take away a little fuel, and go lean and continue switching a little bit high and low. What's important is that it runs within a specified range, and that is usually within 9%. 9% is at the outer threshold. I recommend running at around 3% if you can get those up and down switches to run in that area. You're looking really, really good. You've got an airtight engine and it's solid. Well, Mark, what do you mean 3%? I'm glad you asked. So this is why it's actually really important to use those narrowbands as long as they're working correctly. That 3% is the amount of time that the gases passing over the oxygen sensor are spending, whether they're lean or they're rich. And even small modulations in throttle can still keep the engine in the closed loop area. That way it can maintain a really good economic and efficient burn. When there are slight changes, it may get as high or low as 9%, and the computer is able to correct fueling and maintain control over the engine really well within that range, even as upwards of like 10-15%, as long as it doesn't spend too much time in those rich or lean areas. Now, whenever there's a fault or whenever you've modified the airflow moving through the engine, it's going to stay rich or lean for entirely too long, and it will fault out. It'll fault out into open loop. So by now you should understand that closed loop is idle and cruising, and open loop is wide open throttle. Open loop can also be a fault status. What's important to understand is that the ECU is constantly blending data from all the other sensors and the constant algorithms that it's pulling from. It's never really, just selecting this data and using it raw. It will be interpolating with a lot of different values. So just keep that in mind, that when you affect one thing, it vastly affects many other aspects of the ECU. So when the car is in idle and cruising conditions, again, all of your problems are going to be exaggerated. If you have a vacuum leak, it's going to be pulling a whole lot more air than when you're at wide open throttle, right? So the vacuum leak is easier to find at idle because it's letting you know that it's just not running right. The O2 sensors are going to pick that up. It's going to show a lean condition, and they're going to get stuck in their lean range and try to add fuel and compensate. Hey, there's too much oxygen in here. Don't know where it's coming from. It doesn't represent what the mass airflow sensor is reporting. It doesn't represent all the other environmental sensors that I've gathered, and it's way off from the fueling model. So you have to get things back to correct. And I don't mean necessarily back to factory. What I mean is that you need to have your closed loop, right? I've said it before, I'll say it again. Make sure everything from here to here stays in here, okay? So when it comes to your crankcase ventilation, that has to be routed back into your accordion pipes. All of the oxygen that's entering is being accounted for, and all of it as it's leaving in the exhaust stream. When you have another problem like, say, bad spark plugs or a bad ground which caused a burnt up coil, and you have a misfire on a cylinder, what you're going to end up with is a lot of extra fuel in the exhaust, and the engine will try to take away and it'll be stuck rich. Again, just looking at your O2 sensors and looking at that data can kind of help you think, okay, I need to look in one area versus another. You know what I'm saying? However, some things are a little counterintuitive. As fuel pressure starts to decrease because of a bad fuel pump, what the ECU is going to do is it's going to detect that the system will lean out, and it will increase injector pulse width beyond a controlled value. Again, it's beyond the airflow modeling that's been pre-programmed into that ECU, and it's going to run richer than anticipated. It'll always run richer than anticipated until eventually the fuel pump quits and you don't get a start, or it dies on you. O2 sensor data, kind of over time you develop a feel for looking at it, but it is very important for engine operation. It gets it running smooth at idle and at cruising conditions. And if those areas are correct, then wide open throttle is going to be correct. Lastly, what the engine has is a NOx sensor. The NOx sensor is actually really important on these engines. It's really important that you don't move it either. Essentially, a NOx sensor is just a microphone that's attached to the engine block, and it's listening for what's known as pre-ignition detonation in the engine. Detonation is when the ignition event happens too soon, or temperatures are entirely too hot and the fuel ignites before its timed event. It's entirely bad for the engine. It gets things way too hot. It can cook pistons, it can cook valves. You don't want to ever have that happening in your engine. That microphone has been tuned to a specific frequency to hear those cylinders from its position in the block. So if you put it on top of the intake manifold, you're really kind of messing with its ability to hear what's going on and to detect knock at an early enough stage to back timing off. What I mean by back timing off is inside the ECU there exists another map, actually another set of maps for when the knock sensor gets to a certain threshold, it switches over to another low octane map that has incredibly low timing and a lot of fuel, pretty much open loop, wide open throttle fueling, right? So again, real quick, I just want to go over some common problems that I've seen. And now that we've gone over the sensors, we can understand how these problems can affect the sensors and affect the engine's ability to control fueling and control spark. So vacuum leaks. Vacuum leaks are actually, they're horrible on these engines. A lot of vacuum lines, a lot of them you can get rid of. When we go back together with the 2+2, you'll see the bare minimum that you can get away with and still have a solid running engine. Other than that, you'll have bad injectors, bunk injectors from eBay. Don't do it. Get quality injectors. Usually old injectors are just stuck. You have to do the update from the phase 1 to the phase 2. Bad wiring. Bad wiring is usually the culprit 99% of the time. You know, green and fuzzy looking, corrosion, copper wires that look shit brown, white fuzzy connections where the grounds are supposed to be nice and clean and solid and tight, cut wires. The wiring harnesses on these vehicles have suffered a lot over the years, and they were never great to begin with. So that's usually the problem that I come across with a lot of vehicles that don't run. I'm looking right at the wiring harness. First thing, it's got to get sorted. 30-year-old fuel pumps, those go bad all the time. I don't even trust them anymore. When I buy a Z32, I'm already prepared to put a brand new fuel pump in it. Another problem that I've seen is just a bad throttle body synchronization that can cause a lot of hesitation, a lot of stumbling, and just not really running right, imbalance in the engine. It doesn't like it. But other sources of vacuum leaks could be the O-rings around the injectors. Look at those. The O-rings on the balance tube, look at that. Make sure your accordion pipes are fully seated and fully secured on the throttle bodies. Make sure all of your ports are capped off when you've done deletes. Vacuum leaks, I cannot stress enough, vacuum leaks, vacuum leaks, vacuum leaks. Usually the problem. And the best way that you can take care of a vacuum leak is getting yourself a cheap smoke leak tester from Amazon and using that to figure out what you got going on. Real quick, I'll just show you how to do that. With your system set up the way it is, however it is, take your mass airflow sensor off and introduce smoke right here however you can. You might have to get a cap, you have to get crazy with it, however you can attach it right here. I have a boost leak test kit that I can use, it's got a big old adapter. But you introduce smoke to this entire system, it shouldn't be leaking out anywhere. The only place you'll see smoke come out of should be your oil cap. Even these guys should be recirculating, okay? So that is the quickest way to find a vacuum leak. If you have a bad intake plenum gasket, it'll start seeping smoke right out from there. It's that easy. You know where to fix it. It's a lot better than brake parts cleaner. You can spray it everywhere. Oh, I might have heard something. I don't know. I think it's this. Forget that. Go on Amazon. They're cheap enough. Get a smoke leak tester. Problems that I've seen sometimes, few and far between here and there. I've seen bad coils. Again, if you got bad engine grounds, then you could have a coil potentially go bad. I've also seen bad compression. I've seen bad lifters. I personally have never seen a PTU go bad, but I have heard of them going bad. I do know that when they came out with the Series 2, it was a required update from Nissan. Most of them chose to do it. Every now and then you'll still run into an old PTU. Highly advise getting rid of that thing. Upgrade to the second version. Sometimes you'll find your IAC valve will be sticking or not operating correctly. In my case with my first Z32, the valve had been gutted out of it. Don't know why. Don't do that. So that should serve as a reminder that you should never assume anything. Anytime you just assume a part is good and you dismiss it, you kind of shot yourself in the foot. You need to start eliminating problems and narrowing yourself down to a specific system. Again, air, fuel, and spark, right? So air. Is the engine timed correctly? Am I pulling the correct amount of air into this engine? And is it filling the cylinders in the right order? Is my airflow sensor reading correctly? Is my O2 sensor operating? Is it reading correctly? A little less important, but still pretty important. Are my throttle bodies set and synchronized? Do I have any vacuum leaks? Is my idle air control set? These are all things to think about as far as the air is concerned. Compression. Is there enough compression to pull enough air into the engine? Low compression, there's not enough air being pulled into the engine and it doesn't want to run. So all of these things are the air side, and results in the ECU's ability to meter the air that's coming into the engine. Fuel, again, fuel represents our constants. We need to make sure we have good fuel pressure. We need to make sure we have good fuel injectors, and we need to make sure that our injectors represent the data that's in the ECU. All of our fuel specifications need to be absolutely correct in order for the constants in the ECU to match the real world environment. And then all of our variables can take effect and deliver the right amount of fuel. Spark. Spark is usually wiring. Spark is usually timing. Is the crank angle sensor timed correctly? And is your exhaust camshaft timed correctly to represent the correct crankshaft position as referenced by the crank angle sensor? Are your spark plugs in good enough condition to where they can generate spark across that gap? Are your coils in good condition? Are the connectors in good condition? Do you have enough power supply to your coils? Do you have a good ground to your cylinder heads? Because that spark has to eventually ground to the cylinder head. That's where it ends, and then goes right back to the battery, So spark is usually going to be a wiring concern. Fuel is usually going to be a pressure issue. Sometimes it's a wiring concern that results in just not having fuel. So if you have spark and you have injector clicking, but you don't have anything firing because you still don't have fuel, run a fuel pressure test. If you don't have any fuel pressure, go back to the pump, figure out why you don't have fuel pressure. Narrow the systems down and you'll get there. All right, I think I rambled on long enough. It's getting late, so let's go ahead and finish up pulling these cylinder heads apart.